Well, good morning and welcome everyone to the NFU Cymru Net Zero Agriculture Seminar. We are running in a webinar format today, which means all delegates will be kept on mute throughout the session. Questions may be asked by typing in the chat function though. My name's John Davis, I'm NFU Cymru President and I'm a beef and sheep farmer from Merthyr Cynnig in Mid Wales, and I'm your chairman for today's event. It's a great shame that due to COVID-19 we are not able to all meet up together for this event today, but we are delighted that so many of you have taken the trouble to join us virtually for this event. It's almost 2 years since NFU and NFU Cymru launched our shared vision to achieve net zero by 2040, reflecting our desire to produce the most climate-friendly food in the world. In July, NFU Cymru launched our Achieving Net Zero Farming's 2040 goal, a report which identifies the key focus areas for farming if our ambition is to become a reality. It was a great honour last night to speak on behalf of farmers at the UN Framework for Climate Change meeting, and more about that later. We're very pleased to be hosting the event today to provide more information on our net zero vision, and I am delighted to welcome our speaker. First, we will have Dr. Cerys Jones, NFU Climate Change Advisor, who will provide an overview of the NFU Cymru net zero vision. Second, we will have Dr. John Lynch from the University of Oxford, who will give a presentation on methane accounting. This is a hugely complex area, but this work is vital for us as livestock producers so that methane is accounted for correctly in the greenhouse gas inventory. I'm pleased to extend a warm welcome to Edward Morgan of Castell Howell. Edward works on corporate social responsibility for the Castell Howell Group and will provide a supply chain perspective on net zero today. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Llŷr Jones Derwydd as our final speaker today, setting out our net zero from the farmer perspective. It was a great pleasure to welcome the president of COP26, Alex Sharma, to Llŷr's farm back in the summer. Many people talk a lot about climate change, but Llŷr really is walking the walk, and it was great to see the mixture of productivity going on there and his renewables, the range of renewables that he's involved in. So it'll be great to hear Llŷr's active walking the walk perspective later. So each speaker has been allocated 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will have a short Q&A session. We have a couple of pre-submitted questions, and we invite all our delegates to ask questions via the chat function. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Dr. Cerys Jones, NFU Climate Change Advisor. Over to you, Cerys.
Thanks, John, and hello everyone. Good morning, bore da. Hope you're all well. I can't tell you how good it is to be back in Wales, even if it is virtually. So in the time I've got this morning, I'm going to try and answer some questions, which I hope will help you understand the NFU Cymru's vision. I'm going to try and answer what is it, importantly answer what it's not, can we get there, briefly touch on what it looks like on farm, but as John said, you'll hear much more from Llŷr on that. And then to finish off with some highlights of what we've been doing since the announcement almost 2 years ago. So I'll just start off with the first question. What is it? Well, as John said, it is our ambition to produce the most climate-friendly food in the world. And it is great to be in an industry that is ahead of the game on this subject. Only today, Boris Johnson has announced that the UK is committing to 68% reduction in greenhouse gases compared to 1990, and that reduction to be achieved by the end of the decade. And that's the fastest rate of any major economy. And John also mentioned how important this year is, not only for climate change, but for the UK's role in that, because next year the UK is hosting the United Nations Climate Summit in Glasgow. So it's really important that we as an industry talk about what agriculture can do rather than always being seen as the problem. And not only what we can do, importantly, what we need to be able to deliver on that. So what is this net zero aspiration? What does it mean? Next slide, please. So it is, that net bit gives it away. It is about balance, and our sector is perfectly placed to make an important contribution because we can store greenhouse gas, we can store carbon in many different ways, as well as being a source. And not only can we help ourselves, but we can make a contribution to help the UK meet its own economy-wide net zero target. Our emissions, as John has already alluded to, are really different from other sectors of the economy. And our emissions are much more cyclical. And I'm sure John Lynch will say much more about this, much more cyclical than other sectors of the economy. It's not a perfect cycle, of course, which is why we need to do all these things to help reduce our impact. But it's much more cyclical than the one-way street, which are fossil fuels. So how do we get to a net zero position? Well, this is about us balancing our emissions from agriculture by doing three things. Next slide, please. Those three things are, we've arranged them in three pillars. It makes it easier for me to remember. The first is the day-to-day farm business. It's about improving productivity and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this is about managing all those things on farm which give rise to greenhouse gases, whether they're livestock, nutrients, and thinking about the nutrients in animal feed, and energy. Evidence suggests that we're already pretty greenhouse gas efficient compared to other places in the world, but we want to be the best. And there is something here for every farmer, because there are a wide range of measures appropriate to each individual farm, whether you're investing in improved genetics, tackling animal health, changing the way you manage your grassland, collecting data to improve these things, or perhaps using technology to more precisely feed your crops and animals, or investing in energy efficiency. I'm sure all the farmers listening will have already identified something which you're already doing on farm. So that's about pillar one, about improving productivity. The other two pillars then are rely on our ability to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it. And pillar two is about our ability to store carbon on farmland. And the NFU Cymru's aspiration here is very much fixed on the practical opportunities to store and importantly manage the carbon stored in soils, hedges and trees. Not yet. Thank you. Grasslands, and there's a lot of that in Wales, and most of it permanent, already has a really good store of carbon. We need to maintain that and look for opportunities to fine-tune this. For those of you who might have a little bit of arable land, are there opportunities to return organic matter to soils? Can we make better use of the woody plants we already have on farm, hedges and trees? Perhaps looking for opportunities for some hedges, to let some hedges grow bigger, storing more carbon quickly. Can we bring existing woodland back into management? Can we better account for trees outside woodland, because we think that these are currently not accounted for? And all these things are in addition to planting new hedges and trees, but importantly, in a way that fits with food production. And the last pillar is on boosting renewable energy and the bioeconomy. This relies on us taking carbon out of circulation altogether by providing bio-based substitute materials and coupling bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Our sector can produce a range of products which the economy needs to replace things produced by or from fossil fuels, whether they're building materials, packaging, clothing, insulation. And again, let's start from the position of making better use of what we've got. And I'm sure some of you who've heard me speak before will hear me wax lyrical about, well, what a fantastic product that is, which needs to be much better valued. And the important thing in all this is that there are no silver bullets, despite what you might read. We don't have a renewable energy which can substitute for fossil fuels. And this is the realm of marginal gains. And how you put all these measures together on your farm, for your particular farm, I often think it's a bit like a jigsaw, that you need to find the right pieces for your particular circumstances. So that's what it is. What is it not? So it's definitely not about reducing our capacity to feed consumers with high quality, affordable food by exporting Welsh production or greenhouse gas emissions to other countries. And it's certainly not an expectation that every farm will get to net zero. This is a national aspiration. This is about farmers, not only across Wales, but across the UK, working together to get there. So my next question to answer is, and perhaps the $6 million question is, can we get there? Next slide, please. Our analysis, based on work done by the government's own independent advisors, the Committee on Climate Change, and by the Royal Society, shows that we can. Shows that we can balance emissions from British agriculture, which is the bar on the left-hand side, with action across our 3 pillars, with productivity improvements delivering about 1/4 of our aspiration, farmland carbon storage another 1/4, and bioeconomy-based measures another 1/2. There's something really important to realise about this, that this is what we know now. This is what science tells us is possible now. As you know, things change. In 5, 10, 15 years' time, we'll be in a very different place. And science has a really important role in identifying those measures and practices that farmers will need in 5 and 10 years' time to shift the balance between those pillars. Next slide, please. So what does it look like on farm? Because all those words are really great at a really high level, but members always ask what does that mean for me? And you'll hear much more from Llŷr later. But for those of you who haven't seen it, the NFU Cymru and the NFU recently published an electronic booklet of 26 net zero case studies, which is available online. And if you haven't seen it, we can share a link with you. So these are a really diverse bunch of NFU members. Many describe themselves as ordinary farmers. In fact, one said, I'm doing nothing fancy. But of course, there are some fancy things in there. But what really struck me when I talked to all of them, how everyone is doing their bit in ways which best fits their business. And not one of them, like all you farmers listening, not one of them is starting from scratch. And I think the other thing that really struck me was how they'd often discounted some of the everyday stuff that they're doing, the attention to detail that has become day to day, but they've forgotten about, whether it's something as simple as maintaining machinery so that it runs efficiently, or planning journeys to reduce diesel use. And of course, there's a whole lot more, but I don't want to waste your time talking about them now. So please have a look. So what have we been doing? What has the NFU Cymru and the NFU been doing? So it's important that members guide and drive this work. So we have an active net zero steering group with a representative from each national commodity board and forum. And they've been testing various greenhouse gas calculators, which are currently very freely available for farmers to use, to better understand how they fit for different sectors. And consequently, we've been having follow-up conversations with those calculator developers to try and help improve those calculators so they better meet the needs of our members. We've established a science advisory panel. We have experts for each of the 3 pillars to help and guide our work and to challenge us, because it's important that our aspiration is credible, that we are aware of the latest science, and that we can work together to help address those gaps. So what can you do to the farmers listening out there? Next slide, please. So if you're an NFU Cymru member, we need you. We need you to pledge that you're in for net zero. So on the website, you'll find a link to this map. We need you to tell us what you're doing. It'll take you 2 or 3 minutes, and I'm pretty sure that John and probably Aled have already done this. Tell us what you're doing and what you plan to do. And you'll be one of these little stars that appears on the map. So I selfishly, and what does it look like when you've put your star on the map? And that's the little box of text on the right-hand side. And I selfishly chose the farmer that was closest to my hometown in Newcastle Emlyn and Carmarthenshire. But there's a bit of a gap in Carmarthenshire, so come on, all of you out there. I'd like to see you pledge and show us what you're doing. For anyone who's a young farmer out there who've got a young family at primary school, next slide, please. There are 2 options for you to get involved. If you're a young farmer, there are still some weeks to go for you to send in a 3-minute video on your solutions to help NFU Cymru and the NFU get to net zero. And this is a fantastic opportunity, I think, for young farmers' voices to be heard at COP26 next year. And if you have a young family, this year's Farmvention competition for primary schools, and I think perhaps early secondary, is around climate superheroes. So great opportunity to engage the next generation. We can't do this on our own. We need more farmers than ever before, but it needs everybody else to come on board. That means policy, research, the supply chain. Everybody needs to play their part. And so it's great that the rest of the programme will hear from some of these critical partners as we seek to get to net zero. Thank you.
Thank you, Cerys. Thank you, Cerys. That was excellent. Come on, together we can all do this. Let's populate that map of Wales. Let's have there hardly any room to see some green on it. Together we can succeed. So it's a great pleasure now to hand over next to Dr. John Lynch of Oxford University. John, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for tuning in as well. We will have a few slightly technical parts on this talk, and it's obviously a bit tricky doing it remotely to tell if I've lost the room, but bear with me and hopefully we'll get through it. So next slide, please. So in the talk, I'll take us through the general overview of where we are with global warming at the moment, then think about which greenhouse gas emissions contributing to that are coming from ruminant livestock, so cows and sheep. And as we'll see, methane is the real prominent one there. So then we will start to consider how we compare methane and carbon dioxide and some of what I would suggest are issues with how we do that at the moment, and then put it in the context of moving forward and sustainability. So next slide, please. So as of 2011, when the last full IPCC assessment report came out, and the IPCC are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're the body of experts who review the science and then regularly publish reports on where we are and give policy guidance. So as of 2011, in terms of overall global warming, we had carbon dioxide at the top, by far the biggest cause. So most of our warming at the moment comes from our carbon dioxide emissions, primarily from burning fossil fuels and deforestation. But second behind that was methane, and third behind that, nitrous oxide. So these two gases, which are largely from agriculture, they are important contributors to global warming. So we can't ignore them, but I'll argue later that we need to understand them a bit better than we might be at the moment. So next slide, please. So in terms of overall methane, which is the topic of the conversation today, of all the human sources of methane, just under half of that is from agriculture. There's a bit from waste, so in kind of dumps as things are decomposing, there's methane generated there. There's methane generated when we extract coal, some methane escapes. And of course, natural gas that we use for heating is fossil methane, and as that leaks, that's the other big methane source. But agriculture is the single largest, and within agriculture, the biggest methane source is enteric fermentation. So enteric fermentation, this is the process by which ruminant livestock, they're eating grass, and as a byproduct of their digestion of that, they're belching out a lot of methane. And then the other agricultural source is the next biggest is rice production. Then there's manure management. So from ruminant or other livestock, some of the carbon contained in their manure is also lost as methane. But as we can see in the pie chart, enteric fermentation is the biggest single source there of agricultural emissions, which is why the conversation about ruminants is so dominated by methane. Next slide, please. So this is an even further step back. So we can see here that it's giving us the same overview of anthropogenic, so human-generated methane sources. We can also see that just under half of the total methane emissions are from natural sources. So there is also natural emissions of this greenhouse gas occurring. And but the main thing to note from this one is on the right, we can see there's also this section called sinks. So there are natural processes by which methane is removed from the atmosphere, and this occurs quite rapidly in a way that isn't paralleled with carbon dioxide, and that's where a lot of the talk is going to focus on later. So next slide, please. Okay, so that was the big picture overview. When we hear about our carbon footprint or the emissions associated with different ruminant production or ruminant products, what does that actually mean? Where's that coming from? So this is from a paper a few years ago looking at the average carbon footprint from lowland sheep production in England and Wales. And we can see that per kilogram of lamb live weight produced, there were these three different gases associated with that. So first off in the table, we have carbon dioxide itself. So this is from on-farm energy use or energy in the manufacture of inputs used on farm. So some of that carbon footprint is from carbon itself, CO2. And then we have methane. So as I was talking about before, this is because the sheep are belching out quite a lot of methane as part of their digestion. So in terms of the quantity of methane gas, it's not actually very much. There's only 0.8 kilograms produced per kilogram of sheep live weight. But how we'd conventionally report this is scale it up to a so-called carbon dioxide equivalent. And this really increases the reported impact of that methane. So we've gone from 0.8 kilograms of methane to a reported 22 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then finally, there's also a relatively smaller amount of nitrous oxide. So some of this is nitrogen lost through the animal manures, but the bigger source is from any fertilizer application. So some of the nitrogen fertilizer is lost as this powerful greenhouse gas nitrous oxide, and that might be on-farm fertilizer. But for a typical sheep enterprise in England or Wales, it's probably even more strongly from embodied fertilizers in feeds brought on from other farms, and that might not even be from in the UK if you're doing a full life cycle assessment. So as we can see there, this sheep product footprint, and it would be the same for other ruminant footprints, is dominated by methane as expressed in this carbon dioxide equivalent. So as I was getting at there, this is a way of scaling up different gases to report their impact in a nominally equivalent way to an emission of carbon dioxide. And typically this is done using this simplifying metric called the 100-year global warming potential. And from the metric values from the last assessment report, the value for methane for this is 28, and for nitrous oxide 265. So every kilogram of methane is reported as being 28 times worse than a kilogram of CO2 and 265 for nitrous oxide. But as I'm going to argue in the next few slides, I think for some context, this can oversimplify the time-dependent differences between the gases. So next slide, please. So this is a figure from the UK's Committee on Climate Change land use report at the start of the year. So it's showing how for this notionally equivalent quantity of the three different gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, we've scaled them to report them as if they have the same impact, but they're actually having very different effects. So for methane, we have this very strong initial warming after it's released, but within a few decades, most of it's naturally broken down. So the long-term warming contribution of an individual emission is actually quite small. Whereas for carbon dioxide in red, we have a quite consistent amount of warming for the whole time after it's been emitted. And this extends well beyond 100 years, even into the thousands of years. Any fossil carbon that we release now will have a very long-term effect on the climate unless we actively pull it back out of the atmosphere. I'll briefly note here that for nitrous oxide, it's sort of in between methane and carbon dioxide. It's much longer lived than methane, with a lifespan of around 100 years rather than a couple of decades, but still much shorter lived than carbon dioxide. So we can't really think of nitrous oxide as being directly the same as carbon dioxide either. But in terms of getting on track with stabilizing climate change, because over that 100-year time frame that we really need to get on top of things, it is more equivalent, genuinely more equivalent to carbon dioxide. We can treat it a bit more the same as carbon dioxide without running into the same problems we would for methane. So I won't focus on nitrous oxide for the rest of the talk. Next slide, please. So if we think a bit further, so that was what's happening when we release an individual emission of any of these gases. If we start to think about what that means for ongoing series of emissions over time, then we realize that there's actually quite different dynamics between these different gases. So where we've been so far is this version on the left, which is unfortunately bad news, but quite straightforward. If we have increasing emission rates of either carbon dioxide or methane, then we'll have increasing amounts of those gases in the atmosphere, and we'll have increasing global warming. But in this middle panel, if we have constant emissions of either of those two gases, well, constant emissions of CO2, because each individual emission is so long lasting, we're adding more and more CO2 to the atmosphere, even if we keep emissions at the same rate. So constant emissions of CO2 means ever increasing warming. But for methane, beyond the first few decades, if we keep emitting at the same rate, we're not increasing the amount of methane in the atmosphere like we would be for CO2. We're essentially topping up methane to the same levels that it would have been anyway, as it's naturally breaking down. So this means that we're maintaining that elevated temperature for if we didn't have any methane emissions, and there is still some long-term warming component, but it's a much more stabilizing warming impact than it is for CO2. And then if we come to the right panel on falling emissions, we can see that if we bring emissions of either of those gases down to zero, for CO2, because it has such a long-lasting impact, by slowing the rate of emissions, we're only slowing the extra warming we're adding, and only when we finally get to zero or net zero CO2 do we stop extra warming. So net zero CO2 is only about stopping extra warming wherever we are at that point. It's not even going to reverse any of our past emissions. Whereas for methane, if we bring emissions down from their current level, then we're effectively not topping up methane that's already in the atmosphere. So we'd actually be able to bring down the concentration of methane in the atmosphere and reverse some of the warming it's currently causing just by reducing emissions without actively removing it. So because of this difference in the lifetime of the different gases, we can't really anticipate these dynamics by trying to scale them with a single number, which is sort of the problem with the current metrics. Next slide, please. So as I was saying there, this top one is how the conventional metrics, which we commonly report at the moment, work. It's you take your emission of your gas and you multiply it by a single number. So the information you receive from that is basically implying, oh, all the gases are acting in more or less the same way as CO2, but X times worse. And as I was going through on the previous slide, you're always going to miss some of the principles if you're trying to think of the gases that way. So we've proposed this alternative application of the global warming potentials, which we've called GWP star. The equations there, I won't go into it too much today, but expressed in this form, it's actually quite simple. So it's saying that for every methane emission, when you release it, it has a very large impact, as we saw in the figure earlier. So the initial impact is actually even worse than you might think under the conventional metric. So in this formulation, the initial impact is actually 4 times worse than it looks like under the conventional metric. But then after a couple of decades, so after 20 years, but you then automatically imagine most of that impact is disappearing as it's naturally decaying. So to put it more simply, this is saying that it's not really that each individual methane emission is having an additional impact like it would be for carbon dioxide. If you want to understand how are today's methane emissions affecting the climate, then you need to consider, well, what's actually happening to the emissions from a few decades ago, which are breaking down, if you want to know whether your methane is causing extra warming or not. So next slide, please. So this is where it's getting a bit more technical, but this is essentially just showing that under this new approach, we can report methane in a very simple way like this, and it does capture the real climate dynamics. So we can stick the greenhouse gas scenarios in a climate model, and GWP star does a pretty good job of actually capturing the anticipated temperature change. So it means that for sustained emissions beyond a few decades, the impact per emission of methane isn't as prominent as it might appear under the conventional GWP 100 metric. For declining methane emissions, we actually have this reversal of warming, which you wouldn't appreciate if you thought it was just the same as carbon dioxide. And then on the third panel, we can see that if we wanted to have completely stable warming from methane, so that's equivalent to 0 CO2 emissions, we'd only need to decrease methane at a fairly slow rate, around 0.3% per year, rather than completely eliminate it like we need to do for carbon dioxide. So next slide, please. This figure is showing the same dynamics, but I just wanted to hone in on this middle column, which is to highlight it's not all good news, and it's not saying that methane is just less bad than we previously thought it was, because if we're increasing methane emission rates rapidly, then we're actually underreporting the warming impact of that methane from the conventional metric. So it's not that GWP star is saying methane is better or worse than we previously thought. It's just that it operates in a very different way to carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. So that was all the complexities of the metrics and the footprints. But obviously there is only one climate, and it's only having one real life response to our emissions. So this is taking a step back and saying, well, in terms of where we are currently from global warming, how much of that is due to livestock emissions, and especially livestock methane? So this took a climate model, and it ran that model, and then it ran it if we didn't have any of the direct livestock emissions, and that's what these blue ribbons are. So the paper was published a few years ago. So at the time, we were about 1 degree of warming above pre-industrial temperatures. And if we reran our climate scenarios and just didn't have the livestock emissions, we would be about 0.1 to 0.2 degrees cooler than where we are for having had them. So it's not an insignificant amount, so we can't shy away from the fact that agriculture and livestock are contributing to global warming. But we can also see that the current trends is this big grey area of all the accumulating fossil CO2 that this livestock warming is on top of. So next slide, please. So if we don't bother mitigating either emissions, if we stay on this RCP 8.5 pathway, then we're in big trouble. By the end of the century, we'll be 5 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, which will be a complete disaster for people and the planet. But the biggest cause of that, we will still have that warming from livestock, but it will really be our failure to have decarbonised the economy that's responsible for much of that. Whereas if we switch tracks and stay on this RCP 2.6 to try and stay between 1.5 and 2 degrees, this will meet our objectives, and it entails completely eliminating fossil carbon emissions within the next few decades. And we have to get on top of and reduce ruminant methane, but we don't have to completely eliminate it. So we can have some ruminant methane and still meet our climate objectives as long as we act hard enough and fast enough on fossil CO2. And we still do need to get on top of those ruminant methane emissions. We can't let them keep growing. Next slide, please. So this is from some work in progress. I'll run through it very quickly, but it's essentially showing how in the context of net zero, if we imagine a kind of hypothetical example, roughly reflecting what the world has done over the past 100 years, we've gone from a period of rapidly increasing emissions, hopefully stabilizing them at their current high rates about now, and then we'll bring them quickly down to zero over the next few decades. And the figure on the right is showing that depending on which gases you're talking about there, they actually have very different warming impacts. So if we were rapidly increasing methane emissions, we actually would have been underreporting them compared to CO2 for that increase period. But as we go down to zero emissions, methane emitters are actually reversing some of their past warming in a way that CO2 emitters are only stopping warming at the current level it's at. So I think I'm calling really for a bit more nuance in the net zero discussions and what we're asking different actors to do, and hopefully have a better overview of the responsibilities of different sectors while recognising that every emitter does need to control and reduce their greenhouse gases. And the last slide, please. So to try and summarise all of that, I think that the main take home is that it's not new physics, it's more that our communication methods have perhaps oversimplified the way that different gases have different roles in overall climate change. So some of the policy implications of this are still being debated, and especially what we mean by net zero and how we try and achieve that and balance the responsibilities across different sectors, and where the conventional metrics might still play a role there, or where they're perhaps too oversimplifying and losing track of the ultimate temperature objectives. So we still do need to control and reduce all emissions. So we can't just forget about methane in spite of all this new research. And we can't focus on methane and forget about those other gases. So if we're on farms, we still need to decarbonize energy, and we still need to be reducing or offsetting our nitrous oxide emissions. But hopefully this new perspective that we're giving can highlight that there is actually the potential for a sustainable space for some level of ruminant production in a way that we can't envision for ongoing fossil fuel combustion. So thanks very much.
Thank you, John. That was excellent and really broke it down in an understandable way. And I'm particularly pleased as a beef and sheep farmer that there is a sustainable space going forward, and I'm sure many of our members are, but obviously we take our responsibilities very seriously. Now can I ask Edward Morgan, Castell Howell, for his presentation, please. Edward, the floor is yours.
OK, diolch yn fawr John. Wel, prynawn da pawb o ran Castell Howell. Mae'n bleser cael cyfle ymuno gyda chi heddi. On behalf of Castell Howell, it's great to be a part of this discussion today, and I hope you're all well and healthy out there. So over the next 10 minutes, I'll give you an overview of what we're trying to do further downstream of the supply chain. So if we can have the next slide, please. Okay, so a bit of an overview of who we are. We're wholesalers and manufacturers to the hospitality and food service sector. Our customer groups are as follows. We deal with local authority, NHS. They're worth around 21 to 25% of our turnover. And the balance is with pubs, pub groups, restaurants, cafes, etc. And it's no secret that the sector has been under some difficult times in the past 8 months. So I'll, especially with the new regulations being introduced today, whereby well, the majority of our customers need to close at 6 o'clock and are not able to serve alcohol until the foreseeable future. So I'll try and keep to time today to allow anybody out there who wants a sneaky pint before 6 o'clock to get away in good time. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. Okay, and so far as our journey to carbon reduction, and it is a journey, there are a couple of points. The first, we are governed by mandatory requirements. So we have the government's new streamlined energy and carbon reporting, which is SECR. Now, this applies to companies of scale, and it's a mandatory report every year where we capture our carbon information and we present it, and it has to go out with our accounts, with our annual accounts, and it gives recommendations on where we can reduce carbon within our business. Okay, second point, please. Of course, being a customer-driven company, we do try our best to adhere to what our customers want, and none so more than the public sector contracts. I mentioned a little bit earlier that the public sector are worth around 25% of our business. Now, nearly every public sector contract we deal with, whether that's the NHS in Wales, and we supply around 1,800 schools within Wales, we are having increased conversations on what we're doing in the supply chain to manage our greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm aware on Wednesday in Welsh Government, there was a debate going on regarding the new food manifesto, and they discussed targets there to reduce carbon emissions in public procurement to net zero by 2030, which of course is 10 years ahead of the NFU. So the public sector, they're driven by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and also the broader Sustainable Development Goals, number 12 and number 13, where it's incumbent on them, or they are expected to take all measures to combat climate change and its impacts. So that pressure is going to come down the supply chain to us and to our suppliers. So if we can have the next point, please. And again, from our point of view, unlike all manufacturers, there is a cost benefit on introducing carbon-friendly measures. We generate around 8 or 10% of our electricity from solar panels, and through investing in things like taps, which are activated by the hands, we can reduce our reliance on water and the energy needed to heat the water for hand washing. So there are good benefits of introducing carbon-friendly measures within the business. And of course, one of the main reasons it's the right thing to do. We've heard from both Cerys and John then, we can see there is a problem within the food supply chain, and we are under the microscope in terms of our responsibilities in mitigating the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So the next slide will show, okay, if we can click another one, please. So this is what we've been doing as a company. Again, we've been using a tool, which is a spreadsheet-based tool, and it was supplied to ourselves by the National Procurement Service. So we've been asked for a couple of years now to report back to Welsh Government on the impact that our supply chain, or certainly ourselves as Castell Llawel, are having on the environment in terms of the produce we supply to them. So this pie chart is quite a handy, it's quite visible to see where our main impacts are. So you can see the yellow segment there, transport, with 160 vehicles on the road, consuming something up to 2 million litres of diesel a year. We are very heavily dependent on our lorries to move things around. So that in itself, there lies a problem, because the science hasn't really caught up with our demands. It's going to be very difficult to see how we can deliver multi-temperature vehicles, multi-drops on electric powered vehicles by the target of 2030. So we are very reliant on manufacturers of lorries and refrigeration units to come up with solutions. Other areas that we can control here within ourselves, and that's referred to as Scope 1 and Scope 2. Scope 1 and Scope 2 is things that we control ourselves. We have refrigerant. So any leakage, we have lots of chilled units, both on the lorries and here in the depot. So any leakage into the environment, it's an environmental incident, so we need to report on that. But 1 kilogram of refrigerant is very harmful to the environment. So we need to report. It's called an F-gas register. But there are developments there with regards to different types of refrigerant that are more environmentally friendly in the event of a leak. Of course, as a company, we're very heavy on energy. We have refrigeration units and freezers which run, the freezers run at -28. So energy is a big use for us. But what we are finding is we source, as all of us do, electric from the national grid. Last year, we could see that for the first time that renewable energy overtook fossil fuels with regards to the type of energy that was being produced by the national grid. So there's, again, we as many are reliant on other partners in the supply chain to reduce their emissions as well. Packaging use, which you see on the top there, plastics have been very much in the focus of late. But just one example I'll give there, we were asked by a public sector contract whether we could deliver milk in glass bottles. Now, whilst if we were to deliver in glass bottles, we would be reducing our impact from a plastic point of view. But of course, glass weighs so much more than plastic, so we'd need to have more lorries on the road. So I suppose some of these unintended consequences of moving from plastic to other types of packaging would mean that we would increase that yellow segment that would ultimately increase by virtue of having more lorries on the road to deliver glass, which is so much heavier than plastic. Water usage is not too bad, and food waste. Unfortunately, this year we're going to incur more food waste by virtue of the lockdowns we've had. So every lockdown that's incurred, and today is another example, we still have chilled products in the supply chain which we haven't got customers for. So we either mark them down or we hand them to food charities, but some of them aren't suitable due to a very short shelf life. So unfortunately, they have to be disposed of. So that's another kind of consequence of this, of the COVID lockdown which we face within our sector. So they're the things that we can manage, Scope 1 and Scope 2. But how do we have a look at our whole supply chain and take it back to our primary producers, our Tier 1 producers? So if I can have the next, if you can click again for me, please. So that's termed as our Scope 3 emissions. And this is something we've struggled with a little bit because it's kind of beyond our control. So we have been to a few of our supplier farmers with a tool called the Cool Farm tools, which some of you may be familiar with. However, without the correct information being inputted to these spreadsheets, the results are going to be very variable, and I'll come on to some of the implications of that in the next slide. So I'm quite glad we sit on a committee which is led, the Secretariat is RAP, Waste Resource Action Plan, and thankfully there are greater minds than myself there, such as Keris, who spoke a little bit earlier. So I was kind of encouraged to know there's a lot of work being done on the primary sector, driven by people like the NFU, etc. So from our point of view, if we concentrate on our Scope 1 and Scope 2, which is our emissions, and really work very closely with our suppliers and people like the NFU to try and fuse in the Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, so we can get a real life cycle analysis from farm to plate, which if we can go to the next slide, please. So we're already seeing this is how the future may look like from our customer perspective. Now, last year, a pub run by the National Trust became the first in the UK to try and carbon footprint what was on the menu. and the pub is up in the Lake District. We were going to join on as well in a similar kind of project here in Wales. We supplied the National Trust, people like Powys Castle, Dynebor Park up in Llandelo. However, the shutdown in March, a lot of things which were on the priority list have dropped slightly. And this is kind of where we need uniformity in the measures used to measure carbon across the supply chain. Because if you can click again, please, so we can have the arrows coming in. Whether you can see the menu here. Now, when it comes to dictating consumer choice, and this is kind of where everything that John spoke about on Keris, this is kind of where it comes to the fore, is other consumers who are in the National Trust pub more likely to buy the sausage roll and homemade relish, which has 1.01 kilos of carbon across the supply chain, the chickpea and mushroom roll, which has 0.3 according to this, or the lamb and damson stew, which has 3.9, I think it is, or 3.39. And uniformity of figures and everybody singing off the same hint sheet is critical, because when it comes to any commercial benefit, whether it's supplying the public sector or the private sector, there needs to be some kind of audit there, because the scope for various supply chains to use different tools to possibly manipulate, if you like, what the figures are at the end is quite significant. And if it means somebody winning a contract or somebody having a greater presence on a menu, then I can't stress enough how important it is to have stringent measures and audited measures to ensure that the consumer is indeed being told the truth about what's happening in the supply chain. But notwithstanding, the science as I see it is so fragmented at this stage and very difficult to understand. There will be some mistakes and some errors in margin in terms of calculating greenhouse gas emissions. So if you can go to the next one as well, please. And this is an initiative up in London with the Sustainable Restaurants Association, is looking that it's called the One World Plate, or the One Planet Plate rather, so that the food which is presented to the end user, to the diner, is managed and it's got a very low carbon footprint. Because I suppose in as well as doing the right thing for the climate change, I guess we're all looking for that kind of commercial benefit and that USP. If we as a supply chain here in Wales work very hard to reduce our our greenhouse gas emissions, then there has to be some kind of commercial benefit at the end of it. And the evidence you see before us there, I see this happening more frequently on menus, beginning with public sector menus and then moving on to people like the National Trust and other larger pub chains. So I guess that kind of concludes my presentation. I think I've wrapped it up in 10 minutes. So any questions? It is a developing science, and we as Castell Llawel were kind of keen to embrace it to the best of our abilities. So diolch yn fawr, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Edward. Castell Llawel, a fantastic Welsh company. Now, without further ado, on to Llyr. Can you give a farmer perspective on net zero, please, Llyr?
Diolch, John. First of all, I'd like to thank the NFU for giving me the opportunity to talk about my specialised subject, which is myself. So it's great to be able to do that. Rachel asked me to talk about the journey to net zero on our farm. The journey actually started many years ago, before I was even born, in the 1970s, where apparently the fuel prices increased, heating oil was quite expensive, so my father decided to look at alternative energy to heat the house. And we had a small stream going through the farm, and he built a small 10 kilowatts hydro system, which ran for well over 30 years on a very Keith Robinson kind of system, but it worked well. And then fast forward to 2011, the feed-in tariffs came in, and because the technology wasn't there in the 1980s to export the electricity, my father only put a 10 kilowatt in. But in 2011, as the technology caught up, we were able to export electricity. So I was able to invest and build a 30 kilowatt hydro system. And so that was great. We were self-sufficient. We were producing all our electricity, but I was selling a lot of the electricity back to the grid, where I was only getting paid quite small amount, only 4 pence a kilowatt for export. So I started to think about a great way of utilizing this free energy that I was producing. Next slide, please. That's where I found free-range eggs was a great way of uses a lot of energy, electricity. A normal this size farm, 16,000 would use around 7,000 to 8,000 pounds worth of electricity. So by doing that, by building this is a cost, an £8,000 cost that wouldn't occur with the energy. The only issue with free range is it's quite constant, except in the consumption needed, but it just peaks a little bit on hot days in the summer, where we're trying to keep the hens cool. So I invested in a 24 kilowatt solar system to put on the roof. So it worked well because our hydro system is on a small stream, and actually runs down to maybe 2 to 3 kilowatts an hour in the summer. So it worked well having the solar panels on the farm. Can I have the next slide, please? So even though we have this free electricity, I do try and conserve what we do produce. So there was a grants available from the government, from your renewable from the RHI. So we put air source on the house. So our consumption, our home consumption, has dropped to a third of what we previously used. Can I have the next slide as well, please? And but even though we had the free range eggs, I noticed that we were still exporting a lot of electricity, especially during the night from 6 p.m. till 6 a.m. So I invested in a ground source heat pump, which during the night we push in 15 kilowatts of electricity in, and we get 60 kilowatts of energy out, but it's in heat. And this is very much as what Keris mentioned in the beginning. It's a lot of little things that help. So by putting this system in, so next slide, please. By putting this system in, our hens are nice and warm at 18 Celsius, which means that they're not using any energy to keep warm. That's then we've seen a feed reduction of 3 grams per bird per day, which doesn't sound a lot, but over a year it's a saving of just under £5,000. Also, another saving that we found, because we've got the heating, we're able to take the hens in 1 week earlier than our other farmers, which is another saving of £2,400 a year. And because they're putting all their energy into growing and not to keep warm, our hens come into lay 4 days earlier than normal, which is another saving of £1,500. And plus there's a government payment for producing all this, which then comes to overall, with all these little income streams, it's about £18,000 a year to help on the ground source. It's great to be green, I feel, but it's even better to be green and helping the bottom line really and making your farm far more profitable. Is the next slide, please? So another business that I have is I started this in 2006. It's not a great business to talk about, but it's one of those things we have to do. When you keep livestock, you have fallen stock. And in 2006, I built with a few farmers an incinerator, and we were using nearly just over 10 litres of fuel to burn 1 ewe. So I was buying in 12,000 litres of fuel a year, and charging the farmers £12 to get rid of the fallen stock. But about 7 years ago, I happened to see something in the Farmers Weekly, I think, and there was a company in Leek, Derbyshire, where they were taking fallen stock off the farms and producing electricity, green electricity, out of that. So by doing that, we were getting rid of using the fossil fuels. So we were able to bring our prices down. So we were far cheaper than our competitors, which then increased. We were having more farmers coming there. So now basically what happens now is the farmer comes to a little shed that I have just over half a mile away. They put the fallen stock onto a conveyor belt, press the button, it goes into a large skip, and it's taken away to Leek. So one average ewe, a 60-kilo ewe, can produce enough electricity to run one house for 2 days. So that little place that we have, on average, runs 22 houses a year on the energy it's produced. So going back to what Kelly says, it's all these little things that you can do on the farm, which will help the environment and also help your business. As Rachel said, it's a journey that we're on. So, and I'm not at the end of the journey. I'm looking at keeping white hens instead of the brown traditional ones. The white hens produce a slightly smaller egg at 62 grams, only 2 grams less than the original egg, but she eats 7 grams less per day, which in total is 40 tons a year. Now it'd be £11,000 saving. The only issue we have there is the customers in the UK don't particularly like a white egg. So it's a little bit like the chicken and the egg. We're ready to go, but we need the public to be ready to maybe change a little bit of their buying, the ways they buy. The other thing we're looking at is reducing our soya intake for the hens, and trying to buy protein that we can buy in the UK. We are also doubling our shed size next year, and we are putting an air scrubber machine in the system, which is a real benefit for the farm, because we will be producing twice as many eggs next year, but our emissions will be less than we are producing at the moment. And also the air scrubber takes the ammonia out of the shed. It sprays it with sulfuric acid, which then turns the sulfuric acid into ammonia, which is then a fertilizer that we can use on the farm. So I'm hoping next year to be producing more eggs with less emissions, and hopefully buy far less fertilizer than we do currently. And so it's all these small little things that you can try and take advantage of, which will help the business and help the environment. It's just a short one from me. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Cleve. That was excellent, and lots of different improvements going on there, so well done. First of all, so we can move straight to Q&As now. We've got a massive number of questions coming in, so I don't think we'll get through them all. But first one for John at Oxford. Livestock farmers feel they've taken a bit of a hammering on the climate impacts of livestock production, so your research is very welcome. Is progress being made to make sure this important work on methane accounting is reflected in the greenhouse gas inventory? Over to you, John.
Yeah, I'll also flag up briefly. I've tried to reply to some of the live Q&As in the box if people want to look there. I think this work is making kind of political grounds. So for a start, I'll say that it's not new physics. It's more just how we communicate what impact different gases are doing. So in terms of, oh, do the IPCC understand or agree with this science? Well, yes, definitely. We're building all our models from the established IPCC science. We work with IPCC authors publishing it and so on. So the science isn't really disputed. The question is more, how do the current metrics and our suggestions for improvement either facilitate or cause problems for the current kind of international accounting frameworks? And I think that the arguments are still playing out there. So within the UK Committee on Climate Change, there was a good few pages getting into these arguments and looking at our new metric approach within that report. So they're aware of the science and they appreciate that it means methane and ruminant agriculture does have a different part of the climate change story than fossil methane. I think it's unlikely that the UK government will change from its current conventional policy accounting based net zero 2050 targets, but I don't think that's necessarily too bad news for farmers, because as long as they're appreciating that there's a bit more subtlety underneath it than that, I think that it can hopefully mean there's the scope for those discussions about, you have this national target, but it doesn't necessarily mean that every individual producer, every individual sector has to be achieving that by themselves. And I think that Keris made that point for individual farms, and I think they also see it that way. At least that's my impression of the direction and movement from the UK Committee on Climate Change. So there's more to be done. It's all ongoing, hard to predict how some of these policy things will pan out. But I think that, yeah, we're getting somewhere.
Thank you, John. That's really good news. A question now for Keris and possibly a comment to follow from Llyr. Carbon calculators and carbon audit tools, a lot of interest amongst the membership in these, Keris. Can you tell us where we are with that? And Llyr, have you got anything to add after with regards to them? Edward mentioned one that doesn't take account of sequestration, and obviously that's absolutely vital if we're going to improve behaviour and change behaviour going forward. So over to you, Keris.
Yeah, thanks, John, and thanks for the really good question. I would say that if you feel you're an absolute beginner to carbon calculation, I would start off with the NFU's farm status indicator, because I think that will help you start to think about the range of practices that might help you to get on the journey, perhaps give you an indication of where you're starting from and help you think about what sort of data you might need. We have, our net zero steering group, different sectoral chairs have been testing the 3 most commonly available calculators. They're also free, and we can share their experiences with you too, so you can get a feel for which calculator might best your needs. But as John said, none of them are perfect. None of them, some of them don't cover sequestration, which of course is very important to many livestock farmers and particularly important in Wales. So there's work to do, but as a result of some of the testing that the steering group has been doing, we've had really established really good relationships with all 3 calculators, and they're very happy to have a continual conversation about how those calculators can be improved so that they better capture all the things that NFU members are doing? Thanks.
Steve.
Yeah, just there's so many about. I actually filled my eggs. I supply Tesco's, and I had to fill in one in September, and they asked. I think there was something like 40 questions, but not one question asking about how many hedgerows and miles of hedgerows I've got, how many acres of grassland, how many trees I've got. So I think if you're ever in that position having to do to a supplier, you need to tell them that they've forgotten some vital things, and I think that's important to tell the supermarkets that what we're doing, and to make sure that they're using the correct calculators, because they can be totally out really if you're using the wrong one for your farming practice.
Thank you, Steve. And obviously, having sequestration included going forward is non-negotiable from our side of things, and it's really important that that is included in future, I would suggest, with all calculators. Question for Edward here. Do you think the work that Welsh Government is advancing with partners on the Sustainable Brand Value programme can support transition to net zero agriculture? And is there significant enough link, are they sufficiently enough linked, that sustainable farming on our land and sustainable brand values? Edward.
Well, diolch, John. The Sustainable Brand Value Cluster Group, the meetings have been a little bit fragmented due to COVID. Of course, it was picking up some nice momentum towards February, March. But I think the first, for food manufacturers within Wales, as I highlighted in the slides there, the first responsibility is have a look internally to see what your impact on the environment is, what gains can you do, and then take it one step back to your tier 1 or tier 2 suppliers and really work with them closely on a common set of parameters, and with, as Llyr and Cerys mentioned, with tools that give as accurate a indication of greenhouse gas emissions as possible. Now, there are inaccuracies because science is evolving all the time, but I think there is an opportunity here in Wales. Not only it's for the food manufacturers as well to perhaps emulate slightly Origin Green, which the Irish have kind of taken the lead somewhat again, to emulate and to try and position ourselves as a manufacturing nation as being sympathetic towards the environment and the sustainability indicators as well. It's broader than exclusively the environment. So there's positive steps being made by the Sustainable Brand Value Cluster Group. But again, my suggestion and my thoughts there is concentrate on your own business first, and then when you're confident, because it is a step into the unknown and a lot of the terminology is alien and the vocabulary is alien to people. Once you're confident in that, then go back and have a look at your supply chain.
Thank you, Edward. Are there specific things that Welsh Government could do, Edward, within the procurement setup that would enable them to walk the walk as well as talk the talk? You know, they've declared a climate emergency. Are there solid things that they could do within their own procurement to help and support that, Edward?
Without doubt, public procurement can be and is a driver for change. It's a commercial decision then, of course. The tender document process, I've seen in the past 3 or 4 years a shift away from exclusively price-driven decisions on the weighting of the tender documents to look at more environmental and community benefits. And hopefully that continues to integrate some kind of social value into the tender process. It's not exclusively what is the cheapest piece of meat or baked beans or pasta you can buy. There's more to it than that. And I'm kind of pleased with the progress Welsh Government are making. There's a body of work driven by the the foundational economy to look at public procurement, and quite fortunate there's a grant here in Carmarthenshire, so we hope to report back on that in March. So certainly I think where public procurement can lead the way, others can follow without doubt. And again, it is embedded in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and every local authority has a public service board whose responsibility are to implement the Wellbeing Act, and a key part of that is managing the climate. So hopefully there'll be good things to report over the next 18 to 24 months there.
Thank you, Edward, and I'm afraid this is going to be the last question now. Our target for net zero is by 2040. That's 10 years earlier than many others. What are the targets for 2030 and 2025, Cerys? And what help can we give to NFU members to help them assist and reach these goals? Well, I'll do a little bit of what help we can give, and that's about working together, and that's about making sure that sustainable farming on our land and policy across the UK actually fits into the targets that we're going to be announcing in COP26 and that ambition. So really it's about shaping policy going forward to make sure that we do achieve that ambition of being the most climate friendly food producers in the future, and we are able to validate that. But in terms of outlining some of the opportunity around 2025, 2030, over to you, Cerys.
Thanks. We have broken down the 2040 goal into different timescales, but we haven't published it. I think especially with the short-term goal, with that science changes so quickly sometimes that, and I think it'll be a case of continuous refinement rather than perhaps setting interim goals. That's not to say we'll never do it, and it is an interesting reminder that it's something we should keep coming back to. Thank you.
Thank you all our speakers. We are out of time. I'd like to personally thank you and now hand over to our Deputy President, Mr. Aled Jones, who will make some closing remarks. Over to you, Aled.
Well, thank you, John. I'm conscious that I'm here between you and your lunches. And when you do tuck into your lunches, I'm sure you'll be thinking about the slide that Edward showed of the carbon cost of each meal. This is very enlightening, really, and this has been a hugely successful seminar. So our goal for net zero is very, very clear, and I would probably reiterate what Cerys said. You know, it's a suite of measures, so it's achieving efficiencies of production, the enhancing levels of carbon sequestration has to be that, and as Claire pointed out, there's a weakness there in accounting for the sequestration that we have. And likewise, more renewable energy. And I think there is the possibility of having a suite of measures that we can make use of. But let's reiterate again, you know, the net zero agriculture ambition is not, and I say that, it's not about achieving our climate goals by offshoring food production to other parts of the world, expecting other countries to use their scarce resources of land and water to deliver our foods. Now, it is clear that science is advancing all the time, and I was very pleased to have Dr. John Lynch with us today. And so the vital decisions to advance the net zero are all taken on the basis of the latest science and research, if perverse outcomes are to be avoided. So we are grateful for the work that Oxford University is undertaking on methane accounting, which is highly relevant to us as a livestock farmers in Wales. Now, it's been very useful and helpful to have the broader supply perspective from Edward Morgan. We could see that the work that they are putting into scope 1 and 2, as John Davies mentioned, you know, Castell Howell is a very, very well-run, efficient business. But when you get to scope 3, you know, we have responsibilities likewise, and we must play our part there. And it's quite refreshing to see that the work that Llŷr is undertaking on his farm. And I think the message coming back from Llŷr really, they're minor things, but minor things accumulated together does make a significant amount of difference. Now, for everybody on this call, be they consumers, processors, retailers, farmers, we all have a responsibility on making these small steps. So thank you, Llŷr, for those messages, and thank you again for hosting Alec Sharma on your farm during the summer. So our net zero agriculture is not something that will happen just on our own, as I've stressed. is going to require partnership of farmers, government, science and the supply chain all working together to drive this forward. And next year, of course, we'll be looking forward to COP26, the postponed conference, which will be running in Glasgow in November 2021. And farmers will be part of that conference, and we will be showing the huge steps that farmers can contribute most certainly to all this work. Allai ddiolch yn fawr iawn I chi pawb sydd wedi bod ar y galwad yma. Dwi'n hynod diolchgar I chi am cyfranwyr sydd wedi rhoi I hwn a pawb sydd wedi ymuno gyda ni wedi rhoi eich amser. Dwi'n meddwl bod yna lot o fwyd I feddwl amdano fo o hyn allan o'r hyn da ni wedi gael yn ystod y cyfarfod yma. So can I thank Dr Cerys Jones, Dr John Lynch, Edward Morgan and Llyr Jones. But can I also thank our president, John Davies, because I know full well, John chairs the Net Zero group. And the work that John has put into this. He's shown leadership, he's shown vision, and he's actually a driver of this whole approach. So diolch yn fawr, John, for all the work that you've done. So may I wish you well, please. And I think there are so many questions, and we'll try as best as we can to reply to these questions. And I'm really proud of the interaction that's been on this seminar today. Felly, gyda chydig o eiriau, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. Thank you all.